My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing a video interview with Nova Dannels, who had a long career in the credit bureau, mortgage and loan, and real estate business. Then as a volunteer and original charter member of the Linn County Historical Museum Association. Nova, would you like to tell us when and where you were born?
I was born in Benton County. Our farm was along Highway 30, which was Lincoln Highway back in those days. January 14th, 1917.
And what was your folks' name?
George Meyer and Viva Kruger. They were married in 1916.
And I assume they were farmers.
Yes, my dad had been raised on my grandfather's farm, and when Mom and Dad planned to get married, he bought the east half of what was then called Grandpa's home farm, although he had lived across the road for many years before that.
Approximately how many acres was he
We
farming?
had 160.
160 acres.
Yeah.
And did you have any brothers and sisters?
I had two brothers. They were Everett, who was 2 years younger than I was, and born on May 25th, 1919. And then my brother Dwayne, who was born on May 25th, 1921. They celebrated their birthdays together.
Did you go to country school?
Yes, I spent 8 years at country school, a little over half a mile from our house.
You and your brothers both?
We all went to the school there and finished 8th grade. And my brother, I think they closed it the year that he finished 8th grade. It was closed. There weren't enough kids in the neighborhood anymore to keep it going. And so the ones that were there had to go another mile to the west where my father had gone to school when he was a boy.
Did you have to walk in some pretty bad weather, or did your dad take you when it was snowing?
If it was fit to walk, we walked. When the snow got so deep and it got so cold we couldn't, Dad would take us in the sleigh. And I can remember one time when the snow was so frozen on top that he could drive right across the field. It was a little shorter that way, and I was scared to death that it would go through when he went across the fences, but it didn't.
School, the old country school, I'm sure it didn't have any plumbing. Did it have outdoor toilets?
Oh, yeah. They weren't sometimes they were setting askew after Halloween. They'd come and push them back up. But nobody ever mowed the lawn, and it was a rough yard.
Did you... how many children were going to the country school at that time?
Well, we had anywhere from 8 to 12, 13, I think 15 was the most we ever had at one time, but usually it was around a dozen.
Now, how'd they heat the school? Did they have a stove or a furnace down in the basement?
We had no basement. It was just practically sitting on the ground. The schoolhouse was. But anyway, we had at first a big old pot-bellied stove, and then eventually they got a little more modern one, but the old one heated the place better.
And the bigger boys, is probably responsible for bringing in the firewood.
Yeah, they had to bring in the coal and cobs and wood, whatever we had. All the neighbors would bring a load of cobs or wood in, and then the director would buy coal, and we only used the coal when it was to put in at night, so it wouldn't be so cold in the morning, but it usually was anyhow.
How about drinking water? Did somebody have to bring it from home? Or?
Well, there was a well on the school grounds, but it wasn't used enough and wasn't fit to drink, and so we had to go to the neighbors, and there was a house close by. Well, when people lived there, we could use the water from that well, but when the house was vacant, which it frequently was, we had to go further down the road, and two of the bigger boys that were close to the same size would go down and carry a bucket back, and that'd have to last us all day.
And the teacher would let them take turns in going to get the water, the chance to go get the water.
Usually the bigger boys, it was kind of hard the little kids couldn't manage it. They'd end up with maybe half a bucket when they got back.
Do you remember any Christmas programs in the country school?
Oh, yeah, we had a lot of them.
That was a big deal.
Yeah, we had to bring sheets from home to make the curtains across the platform where the teacher's desk usually stood, and we'd learn to recite all the Christmas poems we could find, and usually we'd have some kind of a Christmas play and songs, and we didn't have a piano or anything, so it was just all a cappella.
And then all the parents and the neighbors
Oh
would
yeah,
come.
everybody came, and everybody'd bring a lantern or a kerosene lamp, because we didn't have any even kerosene lamps. Some of the schools did, but we didn't, so there was no light at all unless we brought it.
You ever remember the grown-ups having oyster suppers or chili suppers at the school and play cards?
We never did anything like that at that school for some reason. No, we had those things at our homes.
During the Depression, you would have been probably 16 years old?
The tail end of the Depression, yes. We were still in the Depression when I graduated from high school. But I do remember early on, I know I can remember my mom and dad talking about they didn't have enough money to pay the taxes, and Dad borrowed money on his insurance policy to pay the taxes.
But you children probably didn't really notice it because everybody was poor.
We had everything we needed at home. We canned and had our own meat and chickens and eggs and milk, and the only thing we went to town for was sugar and flour and coffee.
I assumed your mother had a big garden.
We always had a big garden.
Did the kids, they didn't have a choice, they had to help in the garden?
Yeah, we all had to go out and pull weeds and help pick the strawberries.
Shuck peas.
Shuck peas.
How about milking cows? Did you ever get
Yeah.
involved with milking cows?
Oh, I sure did. When Mom and Dad were married, Grandpa gave her an old milk cow. Well, she got old eventually. I don't know how old she was then. But anyway, you could sit down anywhere and milk that cow from either side. And so when I was 5 years old, they decided if she'd stand still, I could milk her. And so I learned to milk when I was 5.
You didn't have electricity then?
No, when Dad built the house, he put in a gas plant that used, oh heck, why can't I think of the name of it?
Storage batteries?
No. It formed its own gas. You put
Carbide?
Carbide, that's the name. And that was fine. You had to have matches in your pocket all the time.
Yeah, could you explain that? Carbide?
Well, it was two big tanks in the basement, and you put the carbide and water in one side, and eventually when it got through its process and came into the other tank, it made the best whitewash in the world. We had the cleanest hen houses in the neighborhood. But I was about 4 or 5, and our neighbor had one that he'd bought at the same time. Well, his was in a kind of a little cave they dug out beside the house. It wasn't in the basement. And one day he went out to check it. He had his pipe in his mouth and opened the door, and everything blew sky high. And as soon as Dad heard about it, he came in the house and turned that carbide plant off, and that was it. The next day he drained it and got it out of the house. So then we used kerosene lamps for a while we arranged to get a Delco. By that time you could get Delco plants.
Did you use lanterns when you go out to the barn at night? Or?
Until he did have it wired to the 32 volt was wired to the barn. That was the only other place. He was scared to death to take a lantern in the barn. He never liked to. So after we had the electricity, he had it wired out specially so we didn't have to carry a lantern in the barn.
Did you have a wind charger or a motor?
It was a motor, a Delco motor that was down in the basement and vented outside, but it made a noise when it was running, but then we'd always charge it in the daytime.
So do you remember what year your folks did get rural electrification?
Rural electrification was, I think, in 34, the year that we were married. They came by finally down the road past our place. A lot of the ones a mile down the road a ways to the north or south didn't have it for quite a while, but we got it when they came down Lincoln Highway.
So it really, with your family having those storage batteries, electrification wasn't really that big of a deal because you did have lights in the house to a certain extent.
They were good lights, and we even had an iron, but it never got hot enough, so we still used the old irons you heated on the cook stove.
What was Noah responsible for? Taking care of the chickens, or?
I took care of the chickens. Oh, I should have brought you a picture of that. I took care of the chickens, and I raised the ducks and the geese, and we would mix bran and ground corn, and my cousin had a machine that made oatmeal out of oats. It hauled them and made oatmeal, and so I'd mix that up with water, and the ducks would follow me around whenever I had a bucket in my hand and waited for me to set it down, and then they'd come and eat out of my hands.
Did your mother have a lot of laying hens?
Oh, yeah, we sold eggs.
Did she get, was she in charge of that egg money?
Yeah, that was our housekeeping grocery money, that and the cream money. And if there was anything that we needed around the house that we couldn't pay for from the money we were saving to pay the farm bills, why, we'd use the cream and egg money. Mom always tried to have a little ahead in case we needed it.
Then did the family make it a kind of a ritual that you would go to town on Saturday or Saturday night?
You took the cream and the eggs in until we finally had, Garrison built a creamery. And so then they came and picked up the cream. So we didn't have to worry about it anymore, which was nice because we didn't have refrigeration. We had to keep it down in the basement. It was the coolest place. But the eggs we always took into town. And I can remember when they were 12 cents a dozen. You could take in a case of eggs and get a 3-pound can of Folgers coffee.
Your mother probably didn't have to buy an awful lot of groceries.
No, every fall we bought a couple of 100-pound sacks of sugar, and back in those days, I don't know why, but flour always came in 49-pound bags, not 50. And we'd lay in about 4 or 5 sacks of flour and a couple sacks of sugar and some extra coffee, and if we got snowed in, so what? We had everything we needed.
This is jumping ahead a little bit in your life, but being that we're on flour, did you ever use the flour sacks that had the fancy print on to make clothes?
Heavens, yes. In fact, that's what my daughter wore to school. I learned to sew in high school and made her clothes back then.
You weren't on the farm then. How did you did somebody give you these sacks, flour sacks?
Oh yeah, Mom raised a lot of younger chickens, and young chickens needed that. That's what the sacks came with, was the mash type thing that you got for the baby chicks. And what she couldn't use, well, we made pillowcases out of them, we made tablecloths out of them, we made just about anything out of them. We used the plain white flour sacks for dish towels, but the printed ones got used for pillow covers, anything you could think of that you didn't have money to buy.
Did she ever talk to the feed man to tell her if she wanted a particular pattern to keep an eye out for?
Well, we always knew when there was a new shipment coming in. And she'd get into town and pick out enough to make a dress or something.
You have a nice photo here of your brothers. You want to hold that up in front of you?
Yes.
How is that, Alan?
Okay, I got the, whoops, you moved down.
This is the old Lincoln Highway before it was hard surfaced.
Mm-hmm. That was 1928.
Who is that in the top photo? Is that one of your brothers?
That is my youngest brother, Dwayne, and the one here is my next to me brother, Everett, and then the other picture is the way our farm looked the year the highway was paved. When I was out taking these pictures, I walked down the road and took one of the farm from a distance.
Now, these fancy automobiles in this picture, is this something that their uncles or
Well,
somebody put
my
together
uncle
for?
was a school teacher, and he and my aunt stayed with us during summer vacation quite often, and so he took my old coaster wagon and made this little racer for them, and they had a big time out on the highway there before it was paved, and then after it was paved, before it was open for traffic. They had a pole, an old handle from a pitchfork that they could push it from the back with, and they just had a ball with that whole thing.
Did you, in the summertime, shocking oats, cutting and shocking oats, did you get involved in?
Oh yeah, when we got big enough to carry a bundle, Dad would say, now you get 7 of them over there in a pile. And then he'd catch up with us, and we'd go on and make another pile. That was before we were big enough to shock ourselves. At least we could get them together for him and save him time.
Then did your dad belong to a thrashing ring?
Yes, we had about a dozen families in the neighborhood. My Uncle Bill, my dad's brother, owned 5 different threshing rigs. And the one that threshed at our place until they paved the road so we couldn't drive on it anymore, because it had these big lugs on the wheels, and they wouldn't let him drive on the paving. one year they decided, well, the Prairie Creek was low enough they could wade across it with a tractor or with a steam engine, and they got it stuck. So that was last year. And then my other uncle, my dad's brother, bought a tractor big enough to pull the separator, and so then we didn't use a steam engine anymore.
Was that a pretty big occasion when the thrashing machine come to your farm for the day?
Oh, yes. Well, the women would always try to find out who'd served what at the meal before so they wouldn't fix the same thing. And everybody tried to outdo everybody else. And I remember my mom used to get up at 3 o'clock so she could get the pies baked. She would never serve them day-old pies. She wouldn't make it the day before. She had to make it the same day. So she'd get the pies done so she could put her 20-pound roast in the oven.
She didn't want it to be said that Mrs. Dannels, or your
Meyer.
mother, served day-old pies.
No, no way.
Was fried chicken popular
We
for
did
thrashing dinners?
we did fried chickens, I think once or twice, because that was a big job. You had to fry so many of them and then put them in a roaster and put them in the oven. And so Mom usually did roast.
And did the
Roast beef.
thrashing crew always wash up and clean up outside?
We had a couple of sawhorses and planks on them and basins and towels, and they'd scrub outside, and then we'd stand at the door and try to brush the flies away so they'd get in without having the room full of flies.
Do you ever recall, Nova, any bad blizzards?
Oh, we had blizzards you wouldn't believe back then. We don't have those anymore. And of course, there wasn't a snowplow when we had a blizzard. Why, it had to melt, or else the guys had to. The neighbors get together, and if somebody had to go to town, why they'd shovel through the snowbank enough so they'd get through with a sled.
And 35, 36 was probably severe.
Yeah, well, of course, we had the paving then and the snowplows then. Yes, it was bad. Really bad.
Do you ever recall an Armistice Day blizzard of 1940?
Yeah, that was the year we were building our house. And we had, one of the fellows that Dick did some carpenter work for was gas man, we called him. And so we had our oil barrel and had it all piped into the house and everything, but we had ordered the oil burning heater early in the summer. And the shortages were beginning to be bad then because they were getting stuff for overseas. We weren't in the war, but they were still sending stuff to England. And so there were shortages. And by golly, we kept bugging them, and they delivered that oil burner the day before the blizzard. Before that, I'd been using one of those little old stand-up kerosene heaters that my aunt loaned me, and I was sure glad we had that hooked up that day.
Hadn't the day been quite warm, quite mild?
Yes, it was about like it has been this winter up until then. And when Dick, I don't know where he was working somewhere, must have had some inside work he was doing, but anyway, when he got home, he and Dwayne were out getting this livestock in, my younger brother, and they saw the pheasants laying out in the field with their wings out like this, just laying there. They couldn't get out of the snow, and they'd have froze to death by morning. And so they worked even after dark with a flashlight out, picking up pheasants and bringing them up and throwing them in the machine shed. I don't know how many they had, but there was a flock of them around there the next morning.
And a lot of them survived?
Yeah, all they could see they found and put in the shed, and they dried off during the night, and then they threw some corn out for them in the morning. And I hope they made it through the rest of the winter.
That was a pretty nice gesture to look
Well,
out for the wildlife like
They
that.
couldn't just see them trapped in the snow. They couldn't go anywhere, and poor things.
How about your the first automobile that your dad had?
He had a 1915 Rio touring car, and he drove it until 1923 when he bought a Chevy sedan, and that got wrecked in 25. In the meantime, he had bought a Model T truck. And so we used that truck. Dad said he wasn't going to buy another car until the road was paved. Well, in 28, they finally got the road paved, so he went to town and bought a 1928 Chevy, which we had when we drove it all through high school.
I can imagine when they paved that highway, that was uptown. That was really nice.
That was something. We had a ball watching them do that all summer. It was quite an experience. They rented part of our hayfield to pasture their mules on. The work was done mostly with mules and slip scoops. They had a couple of old crawler tractors that they used to pull big rollers up and down the highway after they had the dirt piled up to flatten it down so they could pave on top of it. But there wasn't much power equipment. And those 40 mules, boy, we didn't need an alarm clock all summer.
When you're still young on the farm, was Mondays worst day for your mother?
Well, depending on the weather, it usually was.
That was an occasion in itself,
Yeah.
especially in the wintertime.
We had, first Uncle Bill, who was my dad's brother, had a neighborhood blacksmith shop, and he was a handyman that could do about anything. Well, he came down and fixed it so that we could use an old 1-1 engine, little portable engine you could pull around. And so we fixed it so he could hook it up to the washing machine. And my mother had long hair, and she had it braided and thrown over her shoulder at the back. Well, somehow it got on the wrong side of her shoulder and got caught in the wringer. And she started trying to pull it out. Well, she couldn't, but at least it got down to the wringer, and she yelled at me, "Go call Daddy, go call Daddy." Well, Daddy and Uncle Bill were building our machine shed at that time, and they were up there on the roof. And so I'm out there screaming at them, and Dad wasn't paying any attention to me. And then all of a sudden the engine stopped. And he said, "Oh, I'll have to get down and go start that darn engine." So he came and found her all tangled up with her hair, but she's here holding it like this so that it wouldn't pull it off her head. She had a sore head for a while. After that, she pinned it up in a bun before she went near the washing machine.
What'd she do in the wintertime? How'd she dry her clothes?
Well, we'd hang them outside, and sometimes they wouldn't be frozen as stiff as a board, but I can remember carrying in overalls that were just like somebody was in them, standing up, and take them down in the basement and hang them over a line, and by morning they'd be thawed out and pretty well dried. We had a furnace in the basement. Dad believed in modern things, and so we had a forced air, well, it wasn't forced air, it was a gravity furnace. And you know what? Every pipe was papered with asbestos, and none of us died of cancer.
Did you mentioned your mother having a large garden. Did she can meat? She put up meat?
Yes, we canned meat. We canned a couple of different ways. Some of it, like sausage and stuff like that, we would fry and put in stone crocks and then pour lard over it. And then what was the best, and well, you can still buy it down at, the Amish still can it. Cost, I think, about $6-7 a quart, but they just pack the raw meat into the fruit jars and then put them in the oven, and it comes out just like roast beef. And it was good. We liked it done that way. We did that with both pork and beef.
Your mattresses on your beds, what did you put in them to make them halfway comfortable anyway?
The spare bed and Mom's and Dad's bed, and bed my brothers had, were felted mattresses, about 6 inches high, on steel springs, coil springs. But the bed that I had in my room was an old one that Grandma and Grandpa had, I guess, when they started keeping house, a wooden bed, and it was smaller than the others. You couldn't buy a mattress to fit it. So it had a corn shuck mattress underneath, and then on top the feather bed. And so that was my bed. I liked that. It was nice and warm.
Did you ever use straw?
No, Mom didn't like straw. It was messy, and then it didn't hold up as well as the shucks. It'd break up and then get thinner and harder all the time.
Did she ever raise ducks or geese to take the feathers and put them in the pillows?
Yeah, we had all of our own feather pillows. I told you I raised them feeding them. So we always had duck at Thanksgiving and goose at Christmas time.
Radios. When was your first exposure to a radio in your house?
Well, let's see. It was after we got the Delco plant, because we didn't have to take the battery to town to be charged. We hooked it up to one of the batteries down in the basement. That would have been about 1923 23 or 24, we had an old Atwater Kent it was solid metal, heavy as anything, and it was like a box turned upside down, so about yay long and about this high, and to get at the tubes, well, you had to flip it over, and then it had a speaker that sat on top, about yay big around, and we had that, well, I think we still had that when I was going to high school, because I know Grandma didn't even have a radio, and Uncle Fred came down from Waterloo one time and brought a little tiny, well, it's the original plastic Bakelite, I guess they called it, radio about a foot long and 6 inches high, a little tiny thing, but it worked good. And then I think the folks got one kind of like that after that, because then we had that until, oh gosh, I can't remember when they got a bigger one.
Did, when you first got a radio, would your dad let you listen to it any time, or was there a certain time of the day that the radio was turned on?
Most of the time we were outside working during the day, but we listened to a lot of the evening programs, and I can remember when Admiral Byrd went to the South Pole for the first time, and he used to do regular broadcasts, and they were around midnight, and we'd always set the alarm clock and get up and listen to him, and it was just as clear as if we were in the next room, and even on that old radio that we had back then.
Did you know at that time that those some of those broadcasts were being made on by a young boy, radios that a young boy had made in Cedar Rapids?
I learned all about that when we had the exhibit at the
But you didn't know about that.
Well,
it wasn't publicized.
No, it wasn't publicized that he had done all that equipment. In fact, we had the original machine that looked like it was about the size of an upright freezer in the exhibit that we had on Collins, and that was the one that Admiral Byrd had at the South Pole.
Yeah. Your telephone at home on the farm.
Well, let's see. We had the old wooden telephone that hung on the wall, and our number was 2812, and our ring was 2 shorts and 2 longs. And one long got central, and if there was a big emergency, why, you just started ringing and ringing and ringing, and people started running to see what was going on.
It was probably a known fact that whenever the phone rang, everybody
yeah,
on the line would...
Yeah, they had to find out what was going on, especially if somebody was sick or something like that. Why, they'd be very careful about it, but there were people listening.
When there's a severe electrical storm, were you always told to make sure that mouthpiece is pointing towards the ceiling? And
well, I'll tell you, we had an extra lesson on that. I had an uncle that was killed by touching a telephone line. There'd been a bad storm by Keystone, and we were 5 miles from Keystone, and he lived a mile up the road from us. The telephone started ringing, and his wife wasn't well, and she wanted the phone to stop ringing because it was just ringing constantly, and he went out to disconnect the phone from the house, and it killed him. And I can see my dad yet. Before he went, they called and told him about it. And before he went up there, he went out and he got 3 1-befores and nailed them together and put them around the ground wire out by our phone, so I couldn't touch the wire. Then he went up to see what he could do to help him up there.
did you ever see a ball of fire come out of that mouthpiece in an electrical storm?
Well, I did better than that. When we stayed with my folks before we built our house, my first brother, Everett, was killed in an auto accident the year we were married. And my younger brother wasn't big enough to handle the tractor and stuff, and so they asked us to come and stay with them until he got big enough to help, and then we eventually built our little house there. But let's see, what was I?
The telephone.
Yeah. The telephone, when Jackie was a baby, we didn't have a playpen back in those days, so she was in I suppose you've seen them, the old-fashioned cribs that were metal rods, and a little bigger than a playpen. But anyway, we had that down in the dining room to kind of keep her corralled, and the storm came up, and we got a couple of kind of close strikes of lightning, and Mom said, you better go get the baby's crib out of that corner. It's over there by the phone, and I stepped around the corner to shove it over at the other side of the room, and just then it hit, and the bounced off the phone top of the crib and just went all the way around it. Well, thank God she was in the middle of the crib sleeping and wasn't touching any of it. I don't know what would have happened otherwise, but believe me, that crib never got under the telephone again. And I wouldn't even have known it if I hadn't have gone around the door, because it was gone just like that.
So, Nova's growing up, and you went to high school?
I went to high school. We didn't have school buses in those days, and there wasn't anybody else in the neighborhood that was old enough to drive that was going to high school. So I went to Vinton and lived with my grandmother and walked a mile to school each
You
morning.
graduated from Vinton High School?
No, after my brother Everett finished country school, and then there were some other kids that were big and, well, they had moved in the meantime that had kids in high school in Van Horn, and so then we took turns driving. We'd drive our car one week and they would, and so then I finished my junior and senior year at Van Horn and graduated from Van Horn.
Did you, when you graduated from high school, did you have any idea of what you would probably end up doing besides getting married someday maybe? Or did you have any urge to want to go to college? Or?
Well, I wanted to be a nurse, but back then they weren't crying for nurses, and it cost money. And the only, they had the one, Mercy Hospital was the only one that had trained nurses at that time. And they just didn't have the money, and it was too far from Cedar Rapids. You couldn't commute back in those days like you do now. So I didn't get to be a nurse. Well, Dick went into CC camp when he graduated in '33. He was with the first bunch of fellas that went from, they were just starting the Civilian Conservation Corps at that time. And so he spent a year there. Well, then carpenter work was picking up, and his dad wanted him to come home and work with him. So he didn't stay but the 1 year. Well, then there wasn't anything else to do, so we decided to get married when we were young and stupid. And we couldn't rent anything in Van Horn at that time, and they didn't have apartments as such then, and there weren't any vacant houses, and so we stayed with his folks for a while. Well, then when my brother was killed in October, Dad and Mom asked us to come out and help them out. And so we stayed with them until we built our little house there on the farm.
Yeah. And what year did you get married?
1934.
1934? Yeah.
And graduated in May, and we got married July 16th.
And then any children come along?
Jackie was born April 18th of 35. And then, well, we were still staying with my folks at that time, and then, well, there was enough carpenter work that Dick's dad had an old Model T, and Dick didn't have any way to get back and forth to town, and so we rented a house in town for $10 a month and moved to town for, it was less than a year, because it was in the spring when we moved in, and in the fall the basement filled up with water and covered the furnace up. So
You're talking about town. What?
Van Horn.
Van Horn.
Yeah, that was Van Horn.
You have a nice photograph here of you and your husband and your daughter Jackie. Would you like to hold that up?
Yeah, that was
How
taken.
old would she have been?
She was, let's see, 18, she would have been about 9 in April of that year, and we'd had this taken at Christmas time.
And then the war. Where do you recall of Pearl Harbor? What either you or Richard were doing that day when that
Well,
happened?
it was a Sunday, and we were going up to my aunt and uncle's in Garrison for sort of a pre-Christmas thing with my aunts and uncles at their house, and we had got there, and some of the others were coming at the same time. We got out of the cars and were walking in and talking and laughing, and opened the door and started in, still talking and laughing. And I can remember my uncle was sitting by the radio with his ear right up against it because he was kind of hard of hearing, and Aunt Bertie was standing there, shh, 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 shh. And so we shushed, and then they told us what had happened. Now that's where we burned away. They were just broadcasting it as we went into the house, so it was about 11 or thereabouts.
Did Richard know that he was probably eligible for the draft?
Oh, we knew all about that, and at the time we were building, just finishing a combination beauty shop and barber shop in Garrison, and I was helping to do the painting and varnishing and stuff, and we hadn't got the furnace in yet because there was a shortage and we were having to wait on that. So the building was done except for finishing up the heating, and we were having a lot of trouble getting supplies to build that building because even though we weren't in the war until the 7th of December, why, the shortages were, well, we were part way in it, but if it was bad before then, it got worse real fast because within a week they shut off all building. Well, we didn't know if we were going to get that furnace, even though it was ordered. It ended up we had to take a next larger size, but we got that job done. And so then he decided, well, no more building. It was all shut down. So he went down to Wilson's and got on there right away. And, of course, when he was working there, he was exempt because they were, well, it was canned meat like Spam.
Essential to the war effort.
Yeah, that he was exempt. And so he worked there then. And then eventually he was drafted. And in 43, but he started working there in, well, it had been the spring of 42, January. It wasn't spring, it was January of 42 that he started to work there.
Then when did he go into the service?
In April of 43.
April 43.
Yeah, he'd had an argument with the foreman, and they never did get along, and so the guy was real mad at him. He says, "Oh, won't sign your deferment." And Dick said, "I don't care. I always wanted to go to the Navy anyhow." Well, the next thing you know, he gets his draft notice, and then Mac's over there, "Well, I'll go down and take care of it. I'll take care of it." And Dick said, "No." I said, "I want to go to the Navy." Well, at that particular time, you could have your choice. For a long time there, you could just go to the Army. That was it. But he did have a choice, so he went into the Navy.
Yeah. Where'd he end up?
He ended up in Okinawa eventually, but that was after the war was over.
Do you recall what ship? Was he shipboard when he first went into the Navy? Did he?
No.
Was he on a ship or?
He was stationed in California for training, and let's see, he got out there in June. He finished his boot camp in Great Lakes, and he went out to San Bruno, California, which is just out of San Francisco, about 15, 16 miles. They turned it was an old the Tan Foran racetrack was what it was, and they turned it into a Navy station. And so he called and he said, "Well, it looks like I'm going to be here a while." And so then I decided to go out to stay with him until he went overseas. But when they had sent them up to Morro Bay for training, well, what they were training for was taking troops in the small boats to the shore for landing craft personnel was whatever it was they had. It was LST was tanks. I can't remember what it was for men, but anyway, that's what they were doing. Well, right in the middle of it, they quit. Shipped them back to San Bruno and left them there for a while, and then they shipped them over on the other side to Oakland, to another Navy station, and didn't know what they were going to do with them. Well, nobody could figure it out. Of course, they knew then that they were going to drop the bomb. They didn't need those guys, so they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And so eventually they put him on a boat and shipped him over to Hawaii, and he was there for quite a while, and a couple of months, I guess, just sitting around doing nothing. And then they put him on well, they called it an LST. No, not an LST, what was it? YP. Yard Patrol was the official name. YP 623 was the name of it. They were like the fishing boats you see in San Francisco. They were refrigerated cargo, and they shipped them over to Okinawa because the big ships couldn't land right in the bay there. It was too shallow, so they had to anchor out further, and this little boats would go out and pick it up and bring it in. So he was there from summer of 45 until Christmas. He got home Christmas Eve.
So he's just
45.
discharged in December of
Yeah.
45.
That was in California. Then I decided to stay there because I had driven out on tires recapped for the third time
So when did you come back to Cedar Rapids?
in January of 46.
In January of 46?
Mm-hmm.
And then what, did you have a home to live at, or?
Well, the house that we had moved to Cedar Rapids in 1943.
Is this it?
Yes.
That you're talking
yes.
about? There's a picture of Richard there in his Navy uniform.
Oops.
This is a house you had started to build during the war years.
We built that in 1940, and then we moved it in 1943. That was built on my dad's farm.
You just picked it up and moved it to,
Down to Wilson Avenue and what was 22nd Street. We lived in that house for quite a few years and on 3 different streets.
let me show this one here.
Okay, yeah, this is when we were moving it from Wilson Avenue down onto the lot.
Who did you have move it for you? Was
An
it a
old-
moving company or
It
just the
was-
neighbors?
No, he was an old house mover, and he lived in Marengo. We didn't know him from Adam, but he was the only one available. So we went and talked to him. Well, yeah, he thought he could do it. And so he came up and looked at the house, and we followed the route down and got it down there eventually. We had some problems along the way, but then you usually do.
In that picture there.
Yes, and then after the war, when we came home, let's see, the first winter, it was on this other picture here, sitting there in the snow all by itself. Then as soon as we got back in 46, we built a garage, and then we built a room onto it. And then in 52, we built another newer house just south of that, facing what was then 27th Street. It was 22nd when we moved there, and then they changed it 27th. And when the city finally took us into Cedar Rapids, why, it was 29th Street, and it still is.
Here's a nice photo of a family gathering in this home you're talking about.
Yes, this was Easter of 1943, and we moved the house to Cedar Rapids in 1943 in September. So that was a family gathering.
Did your home have this structure just have one bedroom in it, or?
It had 2 upstairs.
Oh, okay.
Jackie's room was a real small room, but just hold a single bed. But it was comfortable.
Yeah.
It was a nice little house.
Yeah. Is the house still on?
It's still there. They have not changed it, except they turned the garage around when Wilson Avenue got so busy with Westdale traffic, and so now they can come out of the garage onto 29th Street. But the rest of the house, they just put cedar shakes on it, which makes it look nicer. It had been shingled with the gray asphalt shingles.
Mm-hmm.
But they, or asbestos, I guess they called them. Anyway, otherwise, it still looks like it did after we put the little room on the one end.
You, what was your first job back here in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids?
Well, when we were moving the house down, we used to stop at the Pine Inn. We were hauling some things, rocks and stuff that we wanted to use to build a fireplace and stuff down there that we had it out on the farm. And so we borrowed my dad's pickup and we'd bring a load of stuff down, and we'd stop and have a sandwich or something at the Pine Inn. Well, Valdy Bald, who was running it at that time, he was nosy, and he came over. I've seen you folks in here several times. You live around here? And he said, oh, we're going to live just across the field here from you. And so he sat down and started talking, and he said, can you bake pie? I said, yeah, I can bake pie. He says, when can you come to work? I said, when we get our house here. That was before we'd even started to move it. So I got hired to bake pies just as soon as I could go to work, and so that's what I did. Of course, when I went to California, I got a job keeping house for a wealthy family, and then when we came back, I went back to Pine Inn, and they changed proprietors, but then I don't know what happened. Val and Bertha DeWald had a place down along the railroad tracks for a while. But I wasn't too crazy about the people that were running it then, and so by then wages had come up a little bit, and I could make as much as stenographers. I was making baking pies.
Yeah. What did he give you for a wage baking pies when you?
I got $25 a week for baking pies and helping cook and taking the place of gals that didn't show up to work and that type of stuff, because I was reliable and could be there. And then eventually, at that time, secretary, lucky if she got $15, 15 to 17 was about the going rate. So found out the credit bureau was paying, what was it, 75 cents an hour, something like that. I think it's what I started out at. And so I applied for a job there and got it. And so I worked there from 1947 to 1952.
Back to these pies. How many different pies would you make for the Pine Inn restaurant?
Well, at that time, they were working, when I started there, they had just started doing the Eastern Iowa Airport. And they worked 24 hours round the clock, and we were the only restaurant in town that had permission to stay open 24 hours. So everybody on that crew came to work. So I had to make a lot of pies. And so I'd make soft pies, chocolate, banana, butterscotch, kind of vary them a little bit. One day I'd make one kind, one day the next. And apple and cherry, and standard was apple, of course, and some of them like soft pies. But anyway, they were a hungry bunch of guys. They ate a lot of them.
You made the comment that you were the only place allowed to stay open.
Well, that was because of the war restrictions. They didn't see. They had blackouts here during the war, and they didn't want downtown lighted up. They wanted people off the streets and home, and well, they had wardens, the guys that went around looking for lights and stuff. It was. I missed a lot of that. For some reason, well, we lived up in the timber outside of Frisco when I was in California, and we didn't have any of that going on there, but it was still going on in Cedar Rapids, I guess, from what I've seen in the old papers that we have.
And didn't you work at the bakery for a while?
Oh yeah, Peter Pan. I worked, Dick's sister worked there, and she called me one day and said, how would you like to go to work at the bakery? And well, I said, I don't know. I got a pretty good job here. She said, well, it's men's wages. It's night hours. And so I got to thinking, well, maybe I could handle it if I worked till 3 at the restaurant and then went down there. No, it was 7 till 11. Wait a minute. And I was working. Well, anyway, Val and I worked it out so that I could go down there after I got off at 7 and work at the bakery.
What was your job at the bakery?
Oh, it was a doozy. They had this great big round oven, huge thing, and they put a cake in on one side, and by cake it was 3 9-inch pans. Well, there were 6 of them. It was 3 long and 2 wide with a steel frame around them. And they'd shove those in on one side, and when it got around to me, I was supposed to grab them with big mitts and throw them on a conveyor belt, and then they went down to be dumped and iced. And so you had to dump them, you had to pick them up and like this and bring them down. Feature doing that for 8 hours. It was worth men's wages. Anyway, that lasted about 3 months, I guess, and then so I decided to go to California, but I managed to save enough money so I could make the trip to California by doing it. So I guess it was sort of my guardian angel looking after me again.
Did you get to take home the rejects, or did you?
No.
Okay, let's go into your career at the credit union.
No, credit bureau.
Credit bureau. Mm-hmm. You were lucky enough to find an opening there, and
well, that's when, as I told you, the secretaries were starting to make a living wage,
mm-hmm.
and back then, $25 a week was not hardly a living wage, but it gradually went up. So I interviewed Mr. Walker, and there were 2. There was the Iowa Adjustment and Credit Bureau, which was a collection agency, and then there was the Credit Bureau. Well, when Mr. Walker finally retired, why, the other outfit bought them out, and so it all became one, but I was gone by then. So I went to work there for 5 years, making credit reports. And, of course, I was doing a lot of work with lending institutions and stuff because the GI Bill and the FHA were building houses like crazy. take up the shortage that had been there all the time during the war. And so I was acquainted with a lot of the people. Well, one day, after 52, after I'd been there 5 years, why Ray Orr from Iowa Securities called and said that the gal he had, her husband was getting transferred out of town and he was going to lose her, and did I know anybody that I could recommend that might need a job? And I said, well, what about me? Oh, you mean you'd be interested? And I said, sure, if it pays enough. So I went over and interviewed him and took the job. And I worked there in almost 12 years, from 52 to 63. And then I started working for real estate companies. And the reason I left there was I got up to $100 a week. And they'd just given me some more responsibility, and the raises came through, and I got passed over. And so I marched in and said, Ray, how come? Well, it's a company policy. No woman's worth more than $100 a week. And I said, oh, well, I'll be here just as long as it takes me to find somebody that thinks I am. And it took about 6 weeks, and Earl Miller got elected state president of the State Real Estate Association, and he was supposed to be doing a lot of traveling, visit every real estate office in Iowa during his year, and he needed somebody that was smart enough to handle the closings and the bookkeeping and everything else. And so there again he called, well, do you know anybody that needs a job? And I said, how about me? Well, come on over and talk to me. So I went over, I got hired $125 a week. And so I went back, and I had told Ray I'd kiss him goodbye as soon as I found a job, and so I went back and I said, well, I'm ready to kiss you goodbye. He wasn't very happy. And pretty soon Mr. Beal, main office was in Waterloo, and he called me. And he, how well I ran that department and how they hated to see me go, and wouldn't I reconsider, I should show some company loyalty. And I said, company loyalty doesn't go to the bank. And he didn't say, well, I'll pay you the same amount, but he did. So I went to work for Earl Miller.
This picture in this brochure, what was that about that time period when
Well,
that
that
was
was
taken?
several years later, quite a few years later. In fact, this was, I had 3 jobs after this before I retired, and then I worked part-time filling in for gals that...
What was your next job?
When I left
Miller's?
Well, at that time, there were 1,200 houses listed and no takers. That was when we were having one of our so-called recessions.
Mm-hmm. The early starting going into the 70s.
Yeah, and Collins was way down, and I thought, well, I always wanted to be a nurse. I'm going to get out of this business. It's too unpredictable. So I went out to Kirkwood and got all signed up. But the 2-year nurses course there was just started in September. You couldn't start any time like you can with some of their classes. And so I had time in between. This was in February. And so I had some time in between, and so I thought, well, I can get things caught up at home. Well, I happened to read an ad. They were looking for somebody at Mercy Hospital in the nursing school. And so I thought, well, heck, maybe I can learn something about nursing. So I went down and applied for that, and it turned out that was when they were moving the school of nursing from the hospital over to Mount Mercy. And Sister James Marie was in charge of that, and she was doing the programming for the classes and setting it up, and she needed a typist. And so I went to work for her. She'd bring the stuff in, I'd type it up, take it down, and have it printed, and then collate it and get it ready for her. And I was doing real good at that, learning, because the nurses were in and out and around, and I kind of knew what was going on, and I thought, gee, this is going to be nice. And I was taking my shots in the meantime that I had to have to go to the school of nursing out at Kirkwood. And then all of a sudden, bookkeeper and closing officer John Zachers he killed his daughter and his wife, I think, and himself. And of course, John was all up upset. He was just sure that he'd absconded with all his money, but they had the books audited and everything was all right. hadn't anything to do with the company. I don't know what. He was a nice guy. I'd worked with him a lot, making loans and stuff when I was at Iowa Securities. That still bothers me as to why he did it. But anyway, then John knew I was available, he thought, so he started calling me. And I said, no, John, I'm all signed up to go to college in the fall, and I'm just going to get out of real estate. Well, he needed somebody real bad. And I said, well, I'm sorry. Well, then he got a hold of Sister James Marie. He was a good Catholic, and so he talked to her. And so then she got me in the corner, and she says, you know, he needs you awful bad. He says, we're just about done, and I got a gal here that can finish up what little bit there is to do. Why don't you go over and help him out? So I went home that night, and I thought, oh, to heck with him. I'm just not going to call him. Well, then he calls me. And so I said, John, I told you I didn't want the job. Well, I got to have somebody now. And Sister James Marie says it's all right. And I said, well, it'll just be till September when school starts. Oh, that'll be fine. We'll get things straightened out by then. Well, so I took the job, went down there and straightened out that mess. And then in June, Dick got in this auto accident and was disabled. He was never able to work again, and so no way I could go to school without somebody's wages to live on. And so I stayed on at Zachars. Well, and we started a mortgage company with him. He set me up in another house next door that he owned so that the people from the other real estate companies could come in and not be exposed to their salespeople and stuff. And that worked out. We had it going real good. And he had promised me a percentage of the loans I made. Well, I'd let it run up to over $1,000, and in the meantime, we'd bought the timber out by Swisher, and we're getting ready to build our house, and I needed to have the stumps shoved out. We had the trees cut where we were going to build the house, and it was going to cost me $1,000 to have this big tractor come out and shove them off down in the gully or someplace. And he says, well, I just can't afford it right now. And I said, well, I've got to have it. I've made an agreement with this man, and I've got the money coming. Well, I just don't think I can afford to pay it. I said, all right, I can't afford to work here anymore, and I went and cleaned out my desk and left. And got an extension on our mortgage on our other house to pay for getting the trees moved. We had an open-end mortgage with Bohemian Savings then. But anyway, that took care of my job at Zachars. And so the next thing you know, Zachars and Gibson's were at each other's throats, whichever one was on top, while the other one was just fit to be tied until they got on top with the monthly reports. And so Fred Gibson was looking for somebody, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested. I said, well, yeah, maybe. So I went down and interviewed him, and I never had really liked the guy, but I went to work for him. And I worked there for several years. Well, then he bought a real estate company in Iowa City and put his brother in charge. His brother was dyslexic and couldn't write an offer or anything, but I had been doing it for him because he'd been working for Fred up in the Cedar Rapids office, and so he sent me down there to get that office going. And Iowa City's a different kind of place. They didn't want anybody coming in doing closings and cutting their attorneys out of business. You couldn't close a sale in Iowa City without an attorney. And he'd sit here and he'd write, well, you write this check and you write that check. Well, when I went to a closing, I had all the checks written and passed them out to the ones that they belonged to and mailed the others for the taxes and stuff. They couldn't stand that. So they were making things hard for Gibson that after a year he ended up selling it back to the guy he'd bought it from. So then I went back to Cedar Rapids. And Fred had said when I went to Iowa City, he said, when things get to running good down there, well, you can come back up here. Well, I went to him and I said, well, Fred, I'm back up here. Where do you want me to go to work? Well, I don't have any place right now. I said, oh? By that time, I guess my salary was getting up there enough that he thought he'd get somebody cheaper if he needed somebody. And so I said, well, fine, if that's the way you feel about it. And so I went home and I thought, I'm going to collect unemployment just as long as I can. So I knew several realtors that call, you know, you had to call somebody every so often and see for an interview or something. And I'd said, "No, you don't want me, do you? You can't afford me." "No, but I could put down their name." I said, "Well, I'm going to put your name down. You won't have anything. You won't give me a job." So I got by with that for quite a while. Well, then finally, executive came along. Well, he had to build an operation going and wanted me to handle that. And so he was willing to pay the money to have me run practically 2 companies, the building company and pay the bills and all that stuff and handle the closings and the mortgages. So I worked for them, and then when I worked at Gibson's, a bunch of guys there got tired of Fred and going to open their own office, and they called and wanted to know if I'd be interested in being their head secretary and closing officer and all that stuff. And so I decided, well, maybe I would. So I went to work for them. They were a bunch of nice guys.
What was their group?
Home Realty.
Home Realty?
Yeah. And they called it Home Realty and let's see, what was it? 84. They got too big. They were hiring everybody they could because they wanted to be bigger than Gibson and Zachers too. And they got a bigger office when the highway, that's when they were building 380, and they had taken over the old real estate Board of Realtors office out on Center Point Road, and so they were selling it back, and so the boys bought it and went over there and started filling it up with people. Well, it just got to be too much. They were hiring more people and couldn't keep track of it, and people started leaving, as they do when they get too big, and so then they closed down. And so then, well, LaRouche's gal had cancer, and so he needed somebody, and so that was the last place I worked full-time until my mother got to the point where I took care of her for 12 years, and she needed somebody there because Dick couldn't take care of her, and he was getting worse too. And so then I retired, although I did get called from one office to another when they needed somebody, because I could walk into any office in town. They were all using the same forms that I had started out with at Iowa Securities. Nobody knew what a closing statement was back then, early on. And so I got them set up, and I was talking to one of the salesmen a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "You know, I went to a closing the other day, and they still have the speed processes." And I thought, my God, that was when I went to work for Earl Miller that I did that. Take a legal form and put all the information that's in the file, like the date of the offer and the buyer and the seller and all that, so they don't have to paw through a bunch of papers. And then everybody adopted it. And they're still using it. That's 40 years ago.
Out of all these jobs, Nova, what one did you enjoy the most?
I really enjoyed them all, even working for Gibson and Zacher. I didn't like either one, but I liked the people. The work was the same, but the people were different, and I guess that was it. Every case was a little bit different.
So now when you think back, did you ever wonder why you didn't go into business for yourself with the knowledge you had then?
Because I couldn't go out and convince people to take on a mortgage or a contract that they couldn't afford, or try to sell them a house I didn't think was suitable for them. And those guys would do anything for a commission, and if I was selling, I'd be expected to do the same thing.
Pretty much like insurance.
Yeah.
You worked on commission.
I worked for...
You were too honest.
Well...
You weren't a good salesman.
I wasn't...
sales lady.
I wasn't... well, I think maybe the mortgage loan thing was because I had to qualify those people. And when I'd sit down and talk to them, I knew then whether they were going to qualify for that mortgage or not. A lot of them got turned down because they'd been oversold by the realtor. And they'd come in sometimes when the loan wouldn't be approved and practically in tears. And I said, well, why don't you go out and look for a little cheaper house? And if they had too many credit card bills or outstanding obligations, I say, now get those all paid off. Find something a little that you're you can qualify for. And I'd tell them that how much they were out of line. And several times they did that and came back, and I got them approved for a loan. So that's, I think, where I learned that I never wanted to try to sell people more than they could.
What year did you retire, then officially retired?
In 1983.
And how old were you at that time?
Oh, I don't have my calculator here. 1917, take that away from 1983 and you'll know.
67?
Yeah, I worked, that's right, I could have figured that out because I worked 2 years past retirement, so I'd have more Social Security for to retire on because we weren't able to save money after Dick. When he went on disability, his pension was $195 a month. If he could have worked until retirement age, he would have got over $500 a month. So we didn't have that. Then Social Security was under $300 when he, in 71 when he was disabled. Well, by the time he died, his Social Security was $860, but mine was more. So if I hadn't have worked, well, it's hard to get along on that much money.
Yeah. So when did you become interested in the Linn County Historical Association?
Well, I've been a member of the Genealogical Society. I've always been interested in family history, and so I joined the Genealogical Society, and there were some other people in there that were, well, kind of the same mind I was, and we got to talking one day and said, well, we're saving all this family history, why aren't we saving some family artifacts? Well, about half of them weren't interested. We just want to do the people, we don't care about the other stuff. Well, the rest of us decided maybe we should be saving some family artifacts, and so we decided to form a museum association. Well, then we found out that the Linn County Historical Society there had been one started back in around 1900, and it lasted a year or two, but the copyright or whatever the name, you couldn't use it again until they released it. So we called ourselves the Linn County Historical Museum Association, so we could get incorporated. And then we started out, we had 69 charter members. And then later we opened up and got some more charter members. I think we ended up with 160 some. We finally cut it off again. And there are just two of us that are still actively working at the History Center as volunteers. Everybody else is either retired or died or in a nursing home or something.
At this time, was there any prominent people in Cedar Rapids that wanted to get involved and help you and work with you?
That was our problem. At first we didn't have. We were all just plain old everyday working people, and we didn't have the money. Ed Kuba was interested, and he was president several years. We would have an exhibit. He had a little building that he owned down there close to his funeral home, and every so often he'd have it cleaned out so we could get some of our artifacts together, but they were all over. Somebody had them in their basement, others in their attic and garage, and I don't know if we got them all back when we finally got the building or not, but at least we got some of them. And anyway, we didn't have, there were about a dozen of us that were the core of the thing. I was the first secretary, and then after Dick got disabled, I had to give that up, and I took my mother about that time too, and so Alberta Cray took over as secretary for several years, and she and I are the two that are still actively here at the History Center. But it just kind of sat there for a good many years. Well, finally, one of our early members that had a little more money than some of the rest of us, she died. She didn't have any heirs, and she left a will with, I think it was $135,000, as I remember, for the express purpose of getting a building. Well, they started looking around, and all they could find was that old lumber yard down there on 8th Avenue. And So they ended up buying it on contract. Well, they couldn't pay for the whole thing because it was much more than that in the first place, and we had to do some remodeling. After all, you couldn't have a museum where there was lumber stacked up, and Quonset huts and that sort of stuff. And so we got one end of it fixed up so that we could open up to the public, but we still weren't getting members. We still didn't have moneyed people. And finally things started picking up, and eventually we hired a director and picked up a little more, and look where we are today.
I noticed down in the lobby there's a picture on the wall, a plaque of a Marge Kincaid.
Marge Kincaid, her father was one of the charter members, and she got interested at that time, and after they died, she was still interested, and by the time we got the building, she was sort of the head motivator, I guess you would say. And so the rest of us all got behind her, and I can remember many times we took up a collection to pay the light bill or the gas bill.
Was it always hard to come across artifacts, or was the public willing to donate?
Well, we got some things after we got the building, but then a lot of people knew that the building wasn't what we should have. The wiring wasn't good. In fact, I used to have nightmares about finding a pile of ashes when I came to work. And you'd plug in 2 or 3 things and kick a fuse. We didn't have circuit breakers. There were fuse boxes, and they were all over the place. We had one guy that knew where they all were, thank goodness. But it wasn't the safest place. We didn't get a lot of good stuff. They brought in a bunch of equipment and tools and old stoves and stuff like that. We had a few things that were more valuable, but they just didn't want to
Part with them.
part with the good stuff. And once we got this building, why, Lord, we're running out of room to put it. Everything's coming in. We have some beautiful things.
Back in these first years, getting started in the first 5, 6, 10 years, how many hours were you putting in a week?
Well, after my mother died, when I could get out, and Dick was still able to motivate on his own and drive a car and stuff, why, I would work, depending on what we were doing. If we were putting up, like, the Christmas exhibit, why, we'd all work every day for the week or two it took to get that up, because we'd have to hunt to find everything and plan it out ourselves. And then otherwise I would come down on Sundays. We tried to keep it open Saturdays and Sundays for people to come in, and so they had to have somebody that could be depended on to do that, and so I did that for Sundays for quite a while, and usually I could find somebody to help me. We had the little gift shop. We used to have quite a few people in, and then during the festival days, why, we would rent out our parking lot to people that wanted to watch the fireworks. That was a few dollars extra, and we'd have a lunch thing out in the parking lot with sandwiches and popcorn and stuff like that, and make a little money.
So what sparked off the big expansion when people really started getting interested
well,
in?
The thing was that Highland, who had title to the building when we bought it, hooked up with life investors. And they finally got tired of carrying that contract because we couldn't afford to make the payments, couldn't even afford to make the interest payments. And so they decided that they would be real generous and write it off as a loss and tear up the contract. So then we were free and clear. And so then we started, well, I don't know just how it came about that we finally got some moneyed people interested. And by that time, Dick was getting bad, and I wasn't able to spend as much time, so I didn't know everything that was going on. But we had Bill Kruger as a director, our second director, and we had remodeled the gallery and perked the building up a little bit, and people were getting more interested in it. And then we started calling it the History Center. And you'd be surprised what a difference that made. Instead of being a dusty old place where there was a bunch of junk, it was a place where you could go and find out something. Well, that's when we started our newspaper files and that bit, and started finding out where we could, if we didn't have the answer, we usually knew where to go and get it, and that's where some of my past experience in hunting out stuff came in handy, because at the Credit Bureau I'd learned that
How to research.
And the city directories are our Bible still around here. We find more information in those than we do just about anything else. But eventually we got some people with enough money, and then the city all of a sudden decided they're the ones that wanted us out of the way. And so they gave us enough money for the building that we could get a start on this, and I guess our credit had improved when we didn't have that contract hanging over our heads. Anyway, we were able to get a loan and get enough personnel that we could really start making progress, which we've done more progressing financially and collecting things and, well, everything. People, more membership, more programs. The programs we have through the schools and things are wonderful now. And
Back then, when you first started up, did you ever imagine that it would be this big someday? Or you probably
well,
hoped
I dreamed that it might be someday. Not when it happened, it came fast, and we really couldn't believe whether it was true or not, I guess, but it is.
So what year did you really start volunteering or getting involved? That was before you retired, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I went to meetings and stuff, and I couldn't hold an office or things because with my mother, I never knew where I was at with her. And
what year was that when you first started to?
69 is
69.
when we. 69 is when we had our first meeting. We had some of them at my house, and then we bent over People's Bank for a while, and then after First Trust built the new bank on First Avenue, we used to meet there, and then after we got our building, why we had places for meetings and stuff.
So you've been associated with it for 30, 31 years?
69 was when we started. That's when we got incorporated to begin with the first time, and then as soon as they let go of the Linn County Historical Society name, why we changed over. So we're officially the Linn County Historical Society, and of course museum here is called the History Center for obvious reasons. And I think we're going to get the Linn County name tied in with that shortly too, because they're giving us funding for quite a few things, and we really are a Linn County society, and nothing shows anywhere unless we put it in with the History Center name.
What is some of your present duties as a volunteer here at the History Center?
Well, I work in the library right now.
Special projects you're on?
The 2003 exhibit sort of started out doing something about the Wright brothers on the 100th anniversary, and then we got to thinking, well, what about the first history of flight in Cedar Rapids? So we decided to tie it all together, because you go out on the street and ask somebody about Hunter Field, what's that? Where was it? The younger generation doesn't even know anything about it.
Why the Wright brothers?
The Wright brothers lived in Cedar Rapids when they were young boys, and supposedly their first real interest in flying came when their dad brought home a little toy helicopter type thing that you used with a rubber band, and it would fly across the yard and fall and come apart. But anyway, that gave them an interest in something could stay in the air for a while, and they started working at it from then on. That was their dream, and it finally happened. And so we're going to, the early part of the exhibit, we're going to feature local, every cow pasture airport we can find out about and have all that as our early part to the Freedom Fest and all that. And then we're going to be able to perhaps have a street named after Dan Hunter and a memorial out where the Gazette building is, where they print the paper now. It sits right in the middle of one of the runways. And
Of the old Hunter Airport.
yeah, where the Hunter Airport was. There are commercial buildings all around it now, but there's a nice area out on the back corner of that lot, right along the street, that we want to get the name changed on, and we're going to put some kind of a memorial to Dan Hunter there. And he's going to get some publicity while we're having the 6-month-long exhibit, and then the Wright brothers, of course, comes up in November, and we'll feature them more at that time.
Why 2003 Nova?
Well, that's the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, and we'll feature that, as I say, in November. That's when they made their flight. But we decided, well, one reason, I got a letter from the Dayton, Ohio Wright Brothers Museum there, and looking for some information on the time that they lived in Cedar Rapids. And in doing that research, why, I thought, well, gee whiz, we've got all this, we'd better do something about it. And then in her letter she said, are you planning to do anything? And, well, that was the year that we opened the building here, and of course we were in the midst of that at that time. But that's what got me started thinking about it, and so then I got Chris and Maurice in the corner, and we started talking about it, and they decided, well, maybe we'd better. So that's the committee I'm working on most now. Of course, I'm doing some other research besides, but we're celebrating 100 years of flight in Cedar Rapids, and there was flight going on here, not established, but they had this big thing that, well, it's sort of like our Freedom Fest now, that they had in October every year out at the old Alamo Park where Roosevelt School is now. And they had balloons and sort of a blimp type thing that was a novelty. And then as soon as there were planes flying, in fact, there were some Wright brothers planes here in Cedar Rapids at that festival at one time. And a plane, I guess, maybe not more than one. But people got interested in flying early on. And so we should celebrate 100 years, because it's been going on here almost as long as, because right after the Wright brothers got the first plane off the ground, why everybody else had the same idea. So it's...
I, as a representative, a volunteer of the Cedar Rapids History Center, the Linn County Historical Society, they would like to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us, Nova. Been very
I'm very happy to share them, and I hope they're not too garbled.